Good day. Yesterday, Monday 31st January 2021, was an important day in the ongoing negotiations between the Russians and the Western powers, and a day when certain things that have been indicated previously look increasingly like they're becoming real. I refer specifically to the point I was making in my previous video, the video which I did just before this one, in which I said, on the basis of a Russian readout of a telephone call or conversation between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin, I said that it seemed as if the French were launching some kind of parallel initiative to discuss with the Russians not just the situation in Ukraine, but parallel to the Americans' pan-European security issues. In other words, this Russian request for legally binding security guarantees. I passed the Russian readout and I pointed out that a particular paragraph in the readout seemed to say that Macron was coming up with proposals which the Russians were willing at least to consider and entertain, and that pointed to a possible negotiation between the Russians and the French, pending or perhaps even being underway. Well, Monday, January 31st, provided conclusive confirmation that such negotiations are indeed taking place, with the second conversation between Macron and Putin happening over the course of 4 days. Monday, of course, being the first working day after Friday. So we could even go further and say that Putin and Macron have spoken to each other over the course of 2 consecutive working days. Moreover, it's clear that the conversation on Monday was not a telephone conversation at all. It was a virtual meeting between Putin and Macron. In effect, a summit meeting, a virtual summit meeting between the two leaders. And the Russian readout of this discussion shows that Macron and Putin are in fact planning a meeting with each other. Now, I'm going to discuss this readout in a moment, and I'm going to discuss some of the other diplomatic activity that took place over the course of Monday 31st January. But before I do that, I would say that Monday 31st January was also a disastrous day for British diplomacy. It was the day when the Russians gave the British an extraordinary rebuke, and one which the British are known to be extremely dismayed and upset about. Now, what in fact happened was this. Boris Johnson and Vladimir Putin had scheduled a call with each other for Monday 31st January. Johnson wasn't able to keep the time for the call because he had to address the British Parliament, the House of Commons, in connection with a domestic political scandal that he is involved in, one which concerns parties that took place in Downing Street and in the Downing Street garden during the pandemic lockdown. A report has been provided by a senior civil servant about those parties, and Johnson came to the House of Commons to discuss that report and to make a speech. His speech, which I should say in parenthesis, was remarkably ill-judged and may have done him political damage. Anyway, the fact that Johnson had to talk to the House of Commons at that time meant that he wasn't able to keep his rendezvous with Putin. The British tried to reschedule the call for later that day, but the Russians refused. And this is where it becomes interesting, because it's now clear that the original time slot that Putin that Putin had allocated to talk to Johnson was instead the time slot that was filled by this virtual meeting between Putin and Macron. In other words, with no need to speak to Johnson, Putin instead decided to hold this follow-up discussion with President Macron of France. But then it gets even worse, because the British, as I said, tried to reschedule a call with Putin, between Johnson and Putin, for later that day, and the Russians refused. And instead of scheduling a discussion with Johnson, the Russians instead conducted a separate discussion with Mario Draghi on the 1st of February. In other words, on the day that I'm doing the video. So Draghi was given precedence over Johnson over the course of discussions between the Russians and the British. So the Russians have signalled to the British that, as far as they're concerned, discussions with the French take precedence over discussions with the British, and more woundingly still, discussions with the Italians also take precedence over discussions with the British. Now, there is a further point that I want to make here before I go and discuss the two readouts that the Russians have provided about these two calls, which is that Draghi and Macron are known to be close friends and political allies. There's even been a discussion recently, there was even a meeting between Macron and Draghi fairly recently, in which it became fairly clear that the two have formed a de facto alliance within the European Union and are coordinating and working together on a range of issues. So the fact that Macron spoke with Putin on Monday, and that a few hours later this was followed up with another telephone call between Putin and Draghi, is not, so it seems to me, chance or a coincidence. It gives further reason to think that some kind of serious negotiation is taking place. The French are leading it, but their allies, the Italians, are also participating, at least in some form. Now, having said this, it's now right to go to discuss the Russian readouts. And again, I'm going to the Russian readouts in preference to the French ones, because the Russian readouts are more informative, even if, as I've said on previous occasions, they're not necessarily entirely reliable. Anyway, this is the Russian readout of the follow-up meeting between Macron and Putin. It was a virtual meeting. We've seen pictures of the two leaders, that the Elysee Palace has released pictures of the two leaders talking to each other, with Macron addressing Putin in a virtual format, though the Russian readout makes it appear that it was a telephone conversation. As I said, the Russian readouts are not always reliable for reasons best known to themselves. The Russians, for the moment, are downplaying the significance of these discussions by making it appear that they were conducted over the phone, whereas the Elysee has made it quite clear that these are actually virtual meetings that are taking place between the two presidents, the Russian and French presidents. Anyway, the Russian readout reads as follows. Telephone conversation with President of France, Emmanuel Macron. Vladimir Putin had another telephone conversation with President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron. And it then goes on to say, the presidents continued exchanging views on the situation around Ukraine and issues related to providing long-term, legally binding security guarantees to Russia. Vladimir Putin once again set forth the principled approaches to those issues. The two leaders agreed to continue contacts by telephone and to promptly consider the possibility of meeting in person. Now, that is a very short readout, but it is actually full of information. Firstly, we learned that the French and the Russians, Macron and Putin, discussed the situation around Ukraine. And that's clearly discussions about the Normandy 4 meeting that's due to take place in Berlin in about 10 days. A discussion which will be about the strengthening of the ceasefire in the Donbass, but which could conceivably lead to future negotiations directly between the Ukrainians and the leaders of the two breakaway republics, Donbass and Lugansk, with the view to achieving a broad settlement of the Ukrainian conflict with autonomy for Donbass, a new constitution for Ukraine, decentralization, a new constitution, new elections, and a negotiated end to the Ukrainian conflict on the basis of the Minsk agreement. So that's something which we know is already underway. The French are involved in those discussions with the Russians. That's been a long-standing process. It got underway years ago, back in February 2015, when the Minsk agreement was first agreed. But then it becomes more interesting. The readout, though very short, becomes more interesting because it says the following. The presidents continued exchanging views on the situation around Ukraine and issues related to providing long-term, legally binding security guarantees to Russia. So that is the first confirmation that the French are now discussing with the Russians the Russian demand for long-term, legally binding security guarantees. The French are now in discussion, one I think has to say, in negotiation with the Russians on this specific issue. I discussed in my previous program about the fact that the French have previously floated the idea of a parallel negotiation with the Russians on this issue of the Russian request for legally binding security guarantees, a parallel negotiation led by them on behalf of the European Union with the Russians in parallel to the negotiation between the Russians and the United States and between the Russians and NATO. And it looks as if definitely now that negotiation is underway. And of course, we hear that Putin once again set forth the principled approaches to those issues. So the Russians have not yet made any concessions. They've not yet retreated on any of the points they've made, but clearly they're engaging with the French. And they're engaging with the French because we learn that the two leaders agreed to continue contacts by telephone. In fact, as we now know, as a result of that photograph published by the Elysee, these are not just telephone conversations. These are virtual meetings between Putin and Macron. As a result of these contacts, they're going to continue these contacts, but importantly, they are preparing a summit meeting, an actual physical summit meeting. They will promptly consider the possibility of meeting in person. So a summit meeting between Putin and Macron is now in the works. And so we have confirmation that there's a negotiation. This was broached in the discussions between Putin and Macron on Friday. The Russians scheduled another meeting between Putin and Macron on Monday. That discussion went further. It is now clear that a negotiation is underway. It is clear that this negotiation between the French and the Russians affects not just the situation in Ukraine, but also Russia's quest for long-term legally binding security guarantees. And it is clear that further negotiations, further meetings between Putin and Macron, either by telephone or more plausibly in a virtual format, are now pending. And this is all going to lead up to a summit meeting between the two men, presumably when they've come to some kind of understanding with each other. So clearly there is a negotiation. It's clear that the British have been frozen out. It's quite likely that the Americans have been frozen out also. And as I'm going to discuss in a moment, it's clear that from what the French ambassador said at a UN Security Council meeting, which also took place on Monday, that negotiation between the French and the Russians is now underway. And as I said, this negotiation between the French and the Russians on Monday, using a time slot which had previously been allocated to Johnson, but which the Russians allocated to Macron instead, that negotiation between Putin and Macron has been followed up by a conversation between Putin and Italy's Prime Minister, Mario Draghi. Now, this is a longer readout, in some ways a much less informative one. I'm going to read it now. I would say the most interesting fact about this Russian readout is not what it says so much as the fact that the Russians published it so quickly. This conversation could only have happened some hours ago. It happened to be precise at 15:20 Moscow time, which is, as I said, just some hours before I'm making this video. Usually it takes the Kremlin around a day to provide an English translation of a readout between of a call between Putin and a foreign leader. The Russians have rushed out this readout, even though, as I said, it doesn't contain anything of enormous interest. I'm sure the reason they've done that is they want to highlight the fact that there's been this discussion between Draghi and Putin. For all we know, this was a virtual meeting as well. And the fact that this discussion is taking place immediately after the more substantive discussion between Putin and Draghi's ally and friend Macron surely is intended to make clear that the Italians are weighing in on the side of the French in whatever discussions the French are conducting with the Russians, and that the Italians are being kept in the loop both by the French and, of course, as this readout makes clear, by the Russians. So what does this readout says? Well, it says the following. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with Prime Minister of the Italian Republic, Mario Draghi. And I'm going to read the entire readout, uninformative as it is. Vladimir Putin conveyed his congratulations and best wishes to President of the Italian Republic, Sergio Mattarella, who was re-elected to this office on January 29th, 2022. That is a strange story, the re-election of President Mattarella, one which Alex and I will no doubt discuss shortly in another video. But let's put that issue to one side and focus on the rest of the readout. The President of Russia and Mario Draghi exchanged information on measures taken in both countries to counter the pandemic. Well, I'm not going to spend time on that. That's part of the course now in all conversations between world leaders. But now it becomes interesting. In connection with the concern expressed by Mario Draghi, expressed about the developments related to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin gave an appraisal of actions taken by Kiev, which is evading compliance with its commitments regarding primarily political aspects of resolving the domestic conflict in Ukraine. The need for the Kiev authorities to take concrete steps in order to implement the Minsk package of measures was emphasized. Now, this is important because, of course, the discussion with Macron, the Russian readout of the earlier discussion with Macron, spoke only about a discussion on the issue of Ukraine, didn't go into details about the Russian position. Well, the Russians have used the conversation between Putin and Draghi as an opportunity again to spell out their position on Ukraine, that it's Ukraine that's dragging its feet on implementing the issue, the implementation of the Minsk agreement, that the conflict in Ukraine is a domestic conflict within Ukraine. It's not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and that the way to achieve a satisfactory outcome is through Minsk being implemented by the Ukrainians, which means in effect direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the leaders of the two breakaway republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So this part of the readout explains the Russian position, but there's no doubt at all that Putin will have to some extent briefed Draghi on his discussions here with Macron, and of course Draghi will have spoken to Macron as well, or at least the Italians will be in touch with the French on this issue also. But then we come to the next issue, which is the development of long-term legally binding security guarantees for the Russian Federation was discussed in detail. Vladimir Putin outlined Russia's key approaches regarding this matter, emphasizing the importance of observing the fundamental principle of indivisibility of security enshrined in the ODYSEE documents that were signed at the highest level. So, a detailed discussion about the Russian desire for legally binding security guarantees between the Russian and Italian leaders directly after a similar discussion between the Russians and the French on the same issue, with the Italians obviously being allied or closely allied to the French, and with the Italians speaking to the Russians directly after the French. And it's difficult to avoid the conclusion, again, that this is the Russians engaging with the Italians over the course of a negotiation on this topic, a negotiation which is clearly being led largely by the French. And then we have another paragraph. Certain bilateral agenda items were touched upon, primarily the ones concerning cooperation in trade and economic exchanges and energy. Vladimir Putin reaffirmed Russia's readiness to further ensure stable supplies of Russian natural gas to Italy, and also expressed satisfaction with the outcome of his recent meeting held via video conference with leading Italian entrepreneurs. The leaders agreed to continue the dialogue in the interests of advancing mutually beneficial Russian-Italian relations. Now, this is the most interesting paragraph of all, because we see that Draghi is talking to the Russians about securing Italy's energy needs. He's talking about ensuring stable supplies of Russian natural gas to Italy. That strongly implies, indeed it all but confirms, that Italy is going to oppose any proposed sanctions that have any bearing on supplies of Russian natural gas to Europe and by extension to Italy as well. And it's not just natural gas. The Italians continue to be interested in pursuing close economic relations with Russia, and Draghi and Putin, just like Putin and Macron, have agreed to stay in contact with each other. So clearly some kind of negotiation is underway. That doesn't mean this negotiation is going to achieve any positive outcome. This is only a discussion, only a negotiation. We don't know whether common ground can be found. We don't know where all this is heading. But talks are underway. The French are taking the lead. The British have been frozen out. NATO and the United States have been sidelined. There are negotiations about Ukraine. There are negotiations about pan-European security issues, as that previous readout, Russian readout, of that earlier conversation between Macron and Putin make clear. And the Russians have confirmed that the latest conversation was about the legally binding security guarantees that the Russians are seeking. And it seems that discussions are now taking place between the French and the Russians on that issue, leading up eventually or presumably to a summit meeting. And at the same time, the Italians are also weighing in, clearly coordinating with the French, clearly speaking to the Russians, and the Italians are also bringing up the question of stable and secure natural gas supplies from Russia in a way that contradicts all the moves towards sanctions and threats which we've been hearing about. So a negotiation is underway, and we have further proof of this from the Security Council meeting, which also took place on Monday. A Security Council meeting, which I'm going to say straight away, was from a US and British point of view, essentially a debacle. And I'm going to discuss the entirety of that meeting shortly, but perhaps the most striking speech amongst the US allies made over the course of that meeting was the one made by the French ambassador Nicolas de Rivière. And it is remarkably different in tone and content from the kind of speeches made by the US and British ambassadors, by the Polish and Lithuanian and Norwegian and Ukrainian ambassadors, all of them weighed in, repeating all the usual talking points and tropes. The British ambassador in particular was talking in the most extraordinary way. The French one took a completely different approach, and I'm going to read out the UN readout. It's not a transcript, but the UN summary of what the French ambassador said. And it reads as follows: Nicolas de Rivière, calling on Moscow to de-escalate the situation, respect international law, and engage in dialogue through existing mechanisms, said the priority is to achieve a rapid de-escalation of the tense situation, as demonstrated by recent talks in the Normandy format in Paris with Germany, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation, as well as today's council meeting. Dialogue must be based on principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity alongside European security concerns. If the Russian Federation refuses to pursue the path of dialogue and respect for international law, the response will be robust and united, carrying severe costs. However, the European Union stands ready to engage to develop its relations with the Russian Federation if Moscow chooses dialogue and cooperation. Now, here we see all the usual concessions, to the Anglo-American point of view, but the tone is very different from that of the other NATO ambassadors. It is none of the hysterical language we see pouring out of the Americans and the British. No talk here of Russian invasions of Ukraine, of Russian threats against Ukraine, of hundreds of thousands of troops deployed and ready to pounce on Ukraine. We see instead talk about the Normandy format, the discussions in the Normandy format. We see about engaging through all diplomatic channels and keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk agreement. We see all of that going on, and we also see that the French emphasizing the need for dialogue with the Russians, and how the European Union, read France, is ready to engage and develop its relations with the Russian Federation. In other words, France at least is looking to achieve some kind of rapprochement with Russia and is expecting that the rest of the European Union will follow. A markedly different statement from the French to those of the other NATO powers. Anyway, that's the French. Now, the Americans and the British called this meeting, and it's difficult to understand, again, what exactly they thought they were going to achieve by it, because this was a meeting called to discuss the situation along the Russian Federation-Ukraine border. That's the purpose that the Americans and the British gave for this meeting. Except, of course, they have a serious problem, because the Russians are saying that there is no crisis on the border. They deny that they have any plan to invade Ukraine. They also say that the situation in Ukraine is an internal matter of Ukraine. They're making no threat against Ukraine at all. To complicate matters still, the Ukrainians also insist that they're not feeling threatened or directly threatened at the moment in any way. So that begs the question of why this meeting was called at all. And in fact, 5 states refused to support the decision to call this meeting. And of course, 2 of those states were China and Russia. China gave Russia its full support over the course of this meeting, as one might expect. But 3 of the states that refused to support this meeting, well, 2 of them included countries like, the 3 of them were India, Kenya, and Gabon. And India, of course, is a country that the United States wants to draw into its alliance system against China. And as we will see, the Indian ambassador, on the contrary, seemed to be leaning towards the Russian position over the course of this discussion. And in fact, since we are going to talk about the Russian position, we might as well mention briefly the various points made by Russia's rather formidable ambassador to the Security Council, Vasily Nebenzia. He made all the obvious points. He said that the Russians are not threatening Ukraine. He said that the deployment of troops within Russia's territory is a domestic matter, not a threat to international peace and security. He rejected the reasoning of the United States for today's meeting. And then when the substantive discussion took place, he went further. He made some really rather powerful points. He said that the Russian Federation's troops have been deployed within Russia's territory on various occasions before, without the hysterics currently being witnessed. He said that there is no proof of the very serious accusation that Russia intends to attack Ukraine. He said that while Western countries claim to be trying to ease tensions, they are instead whipping up panic. And then he made the extraordinary point, you are almost calling for this, as if you want to make your words become a reality, reiterating that Moscow has no plans to invade Ukraine. He went on to say today's actions are yet another attempt to drive a wedge between Moscow and Kiev. He said, noting that the Ukrainian population is actively being brainwashed and inculcated with anti-Russian thinking and a belief that Ukraine must join forces with Europe at any cost. He then talked about the security demands, Russia's desire for security demands. He spoke about the whole talk about an attack on Ukraine as a bogus narrative. And then he also did something which far too few people are doing. He questioned the figure of 100,000 troops, pointing out that Moscow has never confirmed that number. He then reminded everybody about the previous cases when the United States has made all kinds of claims about military threats from other countries, like the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq was supposed to possess. And then he rounded it all up by saying that today's meeting is especially ironic as the United States holds the world record for 2 troop deployments outside its borders, and its military adventures have killed hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. Then he went on, the current crisis in Ukraine is an entirely domestic one, and there is no other option but to adhere to the Minsk package of measure agreements to resolve it. And he's warned against attempts to sabotage those crucial accords. Well, that was what the Russian ambassador said. A forceful speech, but in some ways a very clever one. Well, let's see what the other ambassadors said. Now, I'm not going to discuss those of the NATO leaders. As I said, apart from the French, they all adhere to accepted lines. Let's go instead and look at the non-aligned states. First and foremost, India. Now, India is far and away the most important country that the United States is trying to win over at the moment. It's a huge country. It's a nuclear power. It's a very, it's got by most measures, by some measures, the world's 3rd biggest economy. It's got very powerful armed forces, and the United States wants to win it over and as an ally against China. Well, India refused to support the convening of this Security Council meeting, and the Indian ambassador said things which clearly distance India from the United States. He said that India welcomes the additional observance of the July 2020 ceasefire in Donbass and the reaffirmation of the Minsk agreements as the basis of work under the ongoing Normandy format, including the commitment of all sides to reduce disagreements on the way forward. He noted that the Normandy format will meet in Berlin in 2 weeks. He urged all parties to continue to engage through all diplomatic channels and keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk package. He said quiet and constructive diplomacy is the need of the hour. Quiet and constructive diplomacy, an implied rebuke of the Americans and the British who have been shouting their heads off. He said time for quiet and constructive diplomacy. He said that adding any steps that increase tension may best be avoided by all sides in the larger interests of securing international peace and security. So avoid taking any steps that increase tensions. In other words, no more talk of sanctions, no more talk of US troop deployments to Europe. That's something that is completely wrong and inappropriate. And then he said that more than 20,000 Indian students and nationals live and study in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. The well-being of Indian nationals is of utmost priority. So India, dead against war. It wants quiet diplomacy, not the kind of megaphone diplomacy that the United States and Britain have been engaged in. It wants to see the Minsk package of measures fully implemented, and it wants to see quiet, he wants to see the Normandy format process proceed in the way that it is doing with this follow-up meeting in Berlin. No criticisms of Russia here at all. No talk here about Russia being on the brink of invading Ukraine. And then we get the ambassador from Ghana. And the ambassador from Ghana says that, he notes that there's been a build-up of Russian Federation troops along the internationally recognized border. However, those troops are presently within Russia's national territory. He also noted a concern of Ukraine and other parties over the intentions of the Russian Federation's military build-up. He noted with concern the implications of the situation has had on Ukraine's economy and neighbouring markets, and welcomed the call by Ukraine's president for the easing of the strong narratives on the situation. This must be a time for confidence building to facilitate a restoration of normalcy in Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine wants the Americans and the British to pipe down, and the Americans and the British should pipe down. Yes, there may be lots of troops on the Ukrainian border, on the Russian side of the Ukrainian border, but they are on the Russian side. No invasion is being threatened. All this hysteria, all this megaphone diplomacy is hitting Ukraine's economy. The Ukrainian President Zelensky wants the Americans and the British to calm down, and that's what they should now do. So that's from the ambassador of Ghana. And then we have other ones. We have the ambassador of Gabon. And the ambassador of Gabon describes information about the deployment of Russian Federation troops near Ukraine as disturbing, calling on all stakeholders to demonstrate restraint and follow the path of dialogue. In other words, another suggestion that the US and Britain are not acting with restraint. And then he talks about the international community must activate the channels of preventative diplomacy as enshrined in Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations, adding that the current standoff only deepens long-standing divisions in the Council at a time when cohesive action is needed most. The strength of the Council resides in its unity, he said, echoing President Zelensky's recent pleas for all parties to remain calm and refrain from whipping up panic. So, again, a rebuke of the Americans and the British. You're whipping up panic. You should listen to what the Ukrainians themselves are saying. This isn't a time for megaphone diplomacy. It's a time for negotiation. Engage in negotiation. There's no threat at the moment from the Russians. All their troops are on their side of the border. Let's have no more of this shrill language and threats, and let's instead give peace a chance, negotiations a chance. Ukraine is suffering as a result of this panic that you're whipping up. And then we have another comment, this time from the ambassador of Brazil. Now, of course, Brazil is another very large, very powerful, or potentially very powerful country. It is connected to Russia through the BRICS group, but its President Bolsonaro, is or has been a friend of the United States. And yet, as we will see, the Brazilian ambassador has gone in some ways even closer, even further in aligning with Brazil with the Russians over the course of the Security Council meeting than the Indian ambassador did. because this is what he said. He urged all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to engage constructively in talks aimed at resolving their differences. There is room to restore confidence and find a lasting diplomatic solution to this crisis. It is imperative to apply the United Nations Charter principles in a non-selective manner, noting that the prohibition of use of force, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and protection of human rights are pillars of the collective security system. And then comes the absolutely deadly section. He highlighted the need for good faith in addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties, including those of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, encouraging them to pursue talks on implementation of the Minsk Agreement based on Resolution 2202/2015 and welcoming the resumption of talks within the Normandy format. So, implement the Minsk Agreement. He's reminded everybody that the Minsk Agreement has been endorsed by a UN Security Council resolution. But note these words. He highlighted the need for good faith in addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties, including those of the Russian Federation. So the Russians have legitimate security concerns. The United States and the NATO powers need to address them in good faith. The implication being that they're not doing so up to now. And that's from Brazil. Then we have Kenya. Kenyan ambassador said his delegation abstained on the procedural vote as the impasse between NATO and the Russian Federation is imminently solvable within the diplomatic steps underway, already showing promise. So he expects an imminent resolution. Is he being optimistic? Have the French been advising him? Who knows? Where there are disputes over territorial jurisdictions or security interests, we strongly support patient diplomacy as the first, second, and third option. The United States, NATO, and the Russian Federation have an opportunity to establish a diplomatic framework that will allow them to resolve their differences. Compromise is not surrender. It was the rejection of compromise that led to the Cold War and intervention in Africa, with internal divisions weaponized at the altar of geopolitical rivalry, confirming the adage that when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. He called for an urgent, substantive change to the structure and culture of the Security Council, stressing that we can no longer deny others the power of permanent membership and veto power if today's permanent 5 are unable to deliver on the Council's mandate. Urging all parties to ensure that negotiations respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, he said innovative diplomacy could also allow for such agreements between today's major powers, inspired by the 1975 Helsinki Accords. Such agreements, however, must advance the principle of non-interference in Africa and the rest of the world, he said, urging Ukraine's leaders to strengthen national unity among all Ukrainians as the surest path to lasting peace. Urging Ukraine's leaders to strengthen national unity among all Ukrainians as the surest path to lasting peace. In other words, please, Ukraine, get on with it, negotiate with the people in the Donbass, settle your differences in Ukraine, follow the pathway set out in the Minsk Agreement, because that is the way to lasting peace. And for the rest, well, let Western powers please listen. Compromise is not surrender. You need to start negotiating with the Russians about security in Europe. The Russians clearly have security concerns because the way you're going about things, you're creating tensions and divisions which have the danger of spilling over into Africa and other places around the world, just as the Cold War tensions did when the Cold War started. So concessions and compromise on this issue of Russia having no right to NATO, to the issue of NATO expansion. This isn't a reasonable position. Start negotiating in good faith, end geopolitical rivalry, and if you can't do it, well, we need to look at the structure of the Security Council and go about it in a way that dilutes the dominance of the Western powers in the Security Council. You're overrepresented there. We have to have other countries with permanent membership attending also in order to balance out the dominance that the Western powers currently have and which they are abusing, for example, by calling a meeting like this. Not at all supportive words from the Kenyans. And then we have the Mexicans, the Mexican ambassador, and he perhaps goes even further. He said the basic principles to consider regarding this matter, in line with the Charter, are the prohibition of the threat or use of force, non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. On the first principle, the escalation of tensions in Eastern Europe represents a potential threat to international peace and security, thus falling under the Council's purview. Given the prevailing mistrust, all actions that might be considered hostile must be avoided. So this is why Mexico supports this meeting, because there's clearly a tense situation in Europe, and this therefore gives the Security Council jurisdiction to have an opportunity to talk about this, and of course it also gives Mexico a platform to set out its views about what's going on. And now this is what Mexico thinks. And again, Mexico is an important country. It's a G20 economy. It's a neighbor of the United States and all the rest. And this is what the Mexican ambassador says. The Russian Federation's representative was clear that there is no planned invasion, which is a unilateral statement of non-aggression. Echoing recognition that there is no military situation to this situation, he said that various channels for dialogue can ease tensions. On non-intervention, he reiterated the importance of respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As such, the Council must discharge its mandate and determine the existence of an act of aggression. States have the duty to settle disputes peacefully, adding the diplomatic paths in the situation have not been exhausted. The Council must act as warranted by these circumstances, as it is doing with these meetings. In other words, Mexico sees no sign of aggression. On the contrary, what it sees from Russia is a unilateral statement of non-aggression. The Russians say they're not going to invade Ukraine. So, yes, if there's some kind of bust-up in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, well, we would have reasons to act. But at the moment, there is no such reason. There is no statement of aggression by the Russians, no act of aggression by the Russians, and there is therefore no reason for the Council to take any action at all. And then we have the United Arab Emirates. a friend of the United States, an ally of the United States. The United States has a big military base in the United Arab Emirates. And its ambassador said, the dispute in Europe requires countries in the region to engage in a serious dialogue based on the values of stability, coexistence and peace, and through existing mechanisms. Welcoming the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, she emphasized the importance of maintaining security and stability and adhering to the Minsk agreements, which will contribute to reaching a comprehensive regional understanding that maintains the security and stability of the concerned countries and addresses all their legitimate concerns. Escalation must be avoided as it could have a negative impact on civilians and exacerbate the fragile humanitarian situation. Respect for and adherence to international law is essential to ensure that the situation in Eastern Europe does not deteriorate further, she said, pointing to the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity and good neighbourliness as indispensable elements in maintaining international peace and security. Constructive dialogue is critical to resolving differences, with the Council's role being essential to provide a diplomatic forum that enables states to present and resolve their differences. Now, note again, solution is through the Minsk agreement. There is the way forward is to negotiate, to pursue a resolution of the crisis in Ukraine through full implementation of the Minsk agreement, which provides for a comprehensive regional understanding that maintains the peace and stability of the concerned countries and addresses all legitimate concerns. Note that not one of these countries, not India, not Gabon, not Kenya, not Ghana, not the UAE, not one of them, not Mexico, not Brazil, not one of them criticizes Russia. I would say that from a diplomatic point of view, from a British and American point of view, this council meeting was an utter debacle. It was a complete mistake, far from most of the non-aligned states backing the United States and the British position that there's some kind of threat to peace from Russia. On the contrary, all of them, without exception, came out and echoed Russian talking points. The way to achieve peace is through the implementation of the Minsk agreement, and the Russians have legitimate security concerns in Europe. It would have been better, in fact, or so it seems to me, from the perspective of the British and the Americans, if the Security Council had rejected their proposals to meet. As it is, we now have a statement from the French ambassador showing that the French do indeed seem to be engaging with the Russians in some kind of discussions which might lead to some sort of outcome, whilst all the non-aligned states, including very powerful ones like India, Brazil and Mexico, are refusing to give the Americans and the British any backing in this matter. If this was not a diplomatic debacle, I can't really imagine what is, and it shows once again how completely at sea the United States and Britain have become in this matter. Well, this was another long video from me discussing two important interconnected topics. More from me soon on this channel, on the Duran with Alex Christoforou, and on Locals. Enough from me now. Look forward to seeing you again and have a very good day.